Imagine a red planet where razor-sharp sand tears at your flesh and purple-eyed hunters track your every move. Welcome to Kelver. 9. A savage frontier where survival hangs by a thread. Elias Vorn, a scientist out of his depth, stumbles into a nightmare of blood and secrets, only to find an alien woman who'll rewrite his fate. Twin suns scorch crimson dunes, chases pound your heart, and moments blaze hotter than the desert itself. Crave cosmic thrills, brutal battles, and sparks that sear the soul? Smash that subscribe button on Alien Whispers now. This isn't for the timid. Fate dragged Elias here, and as shadows tighten their grip, one mystery burns through the storm. Why does fear elude him? On Kelver 9, every step is a fight, every breath a defiance, and the real fire is just igniting. The air on Kelver 9 shimmered with heat, a relentless haze rising from the endless red dunes that stretched like a sea of rust. Two suns blazed overhead, one a furious orange, the other a pale, sickly yellow, casting jagged shadows across the landscape. The sand wasn't soft. It was coarse, sharp enough to sting bare skin with every gust of wind that screamed through the air. Towering rock spires jutted from the ground, their tips honed like the fangs of some ancient beast, weathered by centuries of storms. Dust swirled in violent eddies, the storm's roar blending with eerie, distant cries, sounds that might have been wind or something alive, lurking just out of sight. Elias coughed as the grit coated his throat, his boots sinking into the uneven terrain. The horizon glowed faintly purple where the city of the Kerzal shimmered, a mirage of metal and light too far to reach. Every breath burned his lungs, the heat pressing down like a physical weight. He glanced up, squinting against the glare, and saw dark shapes flicker across the dunes. Too fast, too purposeful to be tricks of the light. The wind carried a metallic tang, a hint of blood and something sour, alien. This wasn't a planet for humans. It was a graveyard waiting to claim him. And yet, he pressed forward, driven by instinct, his heart hammering against his ribs as the first echoes of pursuit grew louder behind him. Elias ran, his legs pumping against the shifting sand as the screams of his research team faded into memory. His jacket hung in tatters, the sleeve shredded where a Kerzal claw had grazed him, blood oozing warm and sticky down his arm. Just hours ago, they'd been calibrating sensors, laughing over stale coffee. Then the air split with a guttural roar, and the Kerzal descended. Purple eyes glinted in the dust, tails lashing like whips, their spear-like weapons flashing as they tore through his colleagues. He saw Dr. Lena's face twist in a silent scream before a blade silenced her forever, her body crumpling into the sand. The memory flashed behind his eyes, sharp and relentless, urging his feet faster. His breath came in ragged gasps, the wound on his shoulder throbbing with every step. He darted between jagged rocks, their edges scraping his palms as he steadied himself. The ground trembled faintly, footsteps, heavy and deliberate, closing in. He risked a glance back and saw them. 3 Kerzal warriors, their bronze skin gleaming under the suns, tails coiled and ready to strike. One raised a spear, its tip glinting with a sick green sheen. Poison, he guessed, from the way it had felled Marcus in seconds. Elias ducked behind a boulder, chest heaving, sweat stinging his eyes. His radio crackled uselessly at his hip, its signal lost in the storm. There was no calling for help, no ship to whisk him away. He was alone, a speck of prey in a hunter's game, and the rhythmic thud of their pursuit grew louder, vibrating through the sand beneath him as he stumbled onward, desperation clawing at his throat. The shadows loomed closer now, the Kerzal's guttural snarls cutting through the wind. Elias sprinted toward a narrow ridge, his boots skidding on loose gravel. A spear whizzed past his ear, embedding itself in a rock with a sharp crack, green venom sizzling where it struck. He didn't stop, couldn't stop. Behind him, a tail lashed out, slamming into the ground where he'd stood a heartbeat before, sending a spray of sand into the air. His lungs burned, his vision blurring as he pushed past his limits. The ridge ended abruptly at a canyon's edge, a yawning drop of red stone plunging into darkness below. He hesitated, feet teetering on the brink. Then a shadow surged forward, a Kerzal, its eyes blazing, claws outstretched. Instinct took over. Elias leapt aside, but the ground betrayed him. The edge crumbled under his weight, and he fell, arms flailing as he plummeted down the steep incline. Rocks battered his ribs, his knees, his skull thudding against a jagged outcrop. Pain flared white-hot through his body, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. He hit the canyon floor hard, rolling into a heap against a slab of stone. Breath knocked from his chest. Above, the Kerzal's silhouette lingered at the rim, peering down, its tail flicking restlessly. Then it turned away, vanishing into the dust. Elias lay still, ears ringing, every muscle screaming as he fought to stay conscious. Heavy footsteps echoed faintly from the canyon's depths, not above, but closer, stirring the shadows around him. Elias blinked, vision swimming as a figure emerged from the gloom. She stood over him, her bronze skin shimmering faintly in the dim light filtering through the canyon walls. Purple eyes glowed beneath a cascade of dark hair, sharp and unreadable. A long, pointed tail swayed behind her, its tip glistening like a blade. Zira. She crouched beside him, her presence both commanding and unnerving, her outfit a patchwork of leather and metal that hugged her form. Elias tensed, expecting a strike, but she only tilted her head, studying him. Her hand brushed his chest, fingers lingering over his racing heart. Her touch warmed despite the chill of the canyon. A faint smirk curved her lips, and she leaned closer, her voice a low, velvet murmur laced with threat and allure. "Why aren't you afraid of me, stranger?" Elias met her gaze, his breath steadying despite the ache in his bones. She shifted, her tail coiling near his leg, and he felt the weight of her presence settle over him like a storm about to break. Zira's purple eyes glinted as she crouched over Elias, her fingers lingering on his chest where his heart pounded beneath the torn fabric. Dust swirled around them, clinging to her bronze skin, and her tail brushed the sand near his leg, its sharp tip catching the faint canyon light. She leaned closer, her breath warm against his ear, a mix of spice and something untamed that sent a shiver down his spine. Elias held her gaze, his voice steady despite the ache in his bones. "I'm not afraid," he said, "because you're too striking to waste on killing me." Zira's lips parted in a faint, curious smile, her hand sliding up to his shoulder, fingers tracing the edge of his wound with a touch both firm and unexpectedly gentle. "Bold, for a human," she murmured, her voice low and smooth, carrying a hint of danger. She shifted, her body hovering closer, the heat of her skin radiating against him. Elias reached up, his hand brushing her arm, feeling the strength coiled beneath her warmth. Her tail flicked, grazing his thigh, a fleeting, electric contact that made his breath catch. She tilted her head, her hair falling across her face, and for a moment, their breaths mingled in the charged air between them. "You're not like the others," she whispered, her fingers tightening briefly on his shoulder before easing away. Elias exhaled, his hand dropping as she straightened, her eyes still locked on his. The wind howled above, carrying faint echoes of pursuit, and Zira's head tilted slightly, her posture shifting as the sounds grew nearer, her tail swaying restlessly behind her. A low growl rolled through the canyon, shaking the loose pebbles beneath Elias's boots. Zira sprang to her feet, her tail snapping upright like a weapon, its tip gleaming in the dimness. Elias pushed himself up, grimacing as pain flared through his bruised ribs. 3 shadows materialized on the ridge above, their outlines sharp against the crimson sky. Kerzal warriors, their purple eyes burning with malice. Sweat glistened on their bronze hides, and their spears shimmered with a faint, venomous glow, tips dripping green. The leader stepped forward, its tail cracking against the stone like a thunderclap. "Traitor," it snarled, the word thick and guttural, aimed at Zira. Elias clutched a sharp rock, his pulse hammering, but she shoved him back with a fierce glare. "Stay out of their reach," she hissed, planting herself between him and the hunters. The leader lunged, its spear slicing through the air, and Zira twisted aside, her tail whipping out to knock the weapon off course with a sharp clang. Sparks flared, illuminating the canyon's jagged walls. The other two fanned out, claws scraping as they flanked her, their tails coiling to strike. Elias ducked as a second spear streaked past, tearing a gash in his sleeve and drawing blood. Zira grabbed his wrist, her grip like iron. "Run," she snapped, yanking him toward a narrow slit in the rock face. Sand exploded behind them as the Kerzal roared, their tails slashing the air, and Elias stumbled after her, the hunter's glowing eyes searing into his back as they charged. They squeezed into the crevice, the rough walls scraping Elias's arms as Zira pulled him deeper, her movements quick and precise. The passage twisted sharply, forcing him to sidestep, his chest burning with each ragged breath. Behind them, the Kerzal's snarls reverberated, claws grinding against stone as they shoved through the tight space. Zira vaulted over a fallen boulder, her tail flicking out to steady Elias as he tripped, his boots slipping on slick rock. "Faster," she urged, her voice tight, though her eyes flicked to him with a trace of worry. He clenched his jaw, ignoring the stab of pain in his side, and followed her through the labyrinth of turns. The air cooled, heavy with the musty scent of damp stone, but the hunter's pursuit thundered on, relentless. Zira's tail suddenly wrapped around his waist, jerking him aside as a spear whistled past, embedding in the wall with a dull thud, venom sizzling on impact. "Too close," she muttered, releasing him with a swift motion. They burst into a wider section of the canyon, its floor strewn with shattered rocks and twisted roots. She leapt across a narrow chasm, landing with feline grace, then turned to haul him over as his feet skidded on the edge. Her hands gripped his, rough and warm, pulling him up as the Kerzal erupted into the open behind them, their tails thrashing, eyes locked on their prey. Elias slumped against a rock, gasping for air as Zira scanned the path ahead, her tail twitching like a restless serpent. The Kerzal's roars echoed closer, the ground trembling under their weight. "Why do they want you dead?" he asked, wiping blood and sweat from his face. Zira's expression hardened, her gaze fixed on the twisting canyon. "I defied them," she said, voice sharp as she grabbed his arm, pulling him into motion. "Killed their strongest warrior to protect the weak." They darted forward, her words cutting through the crunch of their footsteps. "The Kerzal worship power, cruelty. I chose a different path." Elias ducked as a spear soared overhead, its venom hissing against a rock. "You? Mercy," he said, half breathless, watching her tail smash a jutting stone to clear their way. She glanced at him, a faint smirk tugging her lips. "Strength isn't just bloodlust," she replied, leaping a gap and dragging him across. "They branded me a coward for it, exiled me." Her tone grew cold, and she pushed him behind a slab as another spear grazed her arm, coppery blood welling from the cut. She didn't waver, her eyes narrowing at the approaching shadows. "Now they hunt us both," she added, her grip on his hand tightening as the Kerzal's glowing eyes pierced the dust. Elias steadied her for a moment, his fingers brushing her wound, and she pulled away, her tail flicking as she nodded toward a bend ahead. The hunter's snarls filled the air, their claws scraping closer, and she tugged him into a run, the canyon walls blurring past as they raced deeper into its heart. Elias's boots skidded on the canyon floor as Zira yanked him around a sharp bend, the Kerzal's roars fading slightly behind the twisting stone walls. She scanned the shadows, her tail flicking, then pointed to a narrow opening half hidden by jagged rock. "There," she hissed, shoving him toward it. He squeezed through the gap, the rough edges clawing at his torn jacket, and tumbled into a cool, damp cave. Zira followed, her movements fluid despite the tight space. She turned back, her tail lashing out with a swift, powerful strike, shattering the entrance's rim. Rocks crashed down, sealing the gap in a cloud of dust and muffling the hunter's snarls. Elias slumped against the wall, chest heaving, blood trickling from a fresh scrape on his arm. Zira stepped closer, her purple eyes glinting in the faint light seeping through cracks above, and pushed him deeper into the cave shadows. "You owe me your life now," she said, her voice low, almost a growl, as she positioned herself between him and the blocked entrance. The cave trembled faintly, the Kerzal's claws scraping at the rubble outside, their muffled rage vibrating through the stone. Elias wiped sweat from his brow, catching his breath, and glanced around. The walls glistened with moisture, etched with strange, spiraling patterns that shimmered faintly, like echoes of a forgotten time. Zira's tail brushed the ground, stirring the dust, and she crouched, listening as the sounds of pursuit grew more frantic beyond the barrier. Zira turned to Elias, her gaze softening as she noticed the blood streaking his arm. She knelt beside him, pulling a small vial from her belt, some kind of oil, thick and amber. "Hold still," she murmured, her fingers dipping into the liquid before tracing it over his wound. Her touch was slow, deliberate, sliding across his skin with a warmth that made his breath hitch. The oil stung at first, then soothed, and her hand lingered, brushing up his arm to his chest. Elias caught her wrist, his pulse quickening under her steady gaze, and pulled her closer. "Why save me?" he whispered, voice rough from the chase. Her purple eyes flickered, and she leaned in, her lips grazing his jaw in a fleeting, tender kiss, the first real touch of her mouth against him. A shiver ran through her, her tail curling slightly as she pressed herself nearer, her breath warm against his neck. "Because you see me," she said softly, her hand resting over his heart. Elias tilted his head, his fingers brushing her cheek, feeling the smoothness of her bronze skin. The air between them grew heavy, charged with something unspoken, and for a moment, the cave's damp chill faded under the heat of their closeness. Her tail grazed his leg again, a gentle, possessive sweep, and she pulled back slightly, her eyes searching his as the cave shuddered once more, the Kerzal's efforts outside growing louder. A sharp, grating hiss cut through the silence, echoing from the cave's depths. Zira sprang up, her tail snapping to attention as Elias fumbled to his feet, heart pounding anew. From a shadowed crevice, a massive shape slithered into view. A Zareth, its body a writhing mass of sand and sinew, its jagged mandibles clicking hungrily. Its eyes, small and black, gleamed like wet stones, and it lunged, claws raking the air. Zira shoved Elias aside, her tail whipping forward to pierce the creature's flank. A guttural screech filled the cave as it recoiled, sand spilling from the wound, but another hiss sounded behind them. Elias spun, spotting a second Zareth crawling through a crack in the wall, its mandibles snapping inches from his leg. Zira cursed under her breath, leaping to intercept it, her tail slashing through the air. The first beast recovered, charging again, as she twisted mid-motion, driving her weapon-like appendage into its side. It shrieked, thrashing wildly, and Elias grabbed a loose rock, hurling it at the second creature's head. The stone struck true, cracking against its skull, and it staggered back, giving Zira an opening to strike. Her tail plunged deep, silencing its cries as it collapsed into a heap of twitching sand. The cave shook as the first Zareth lunged again, its claws slashing at Zira's legs. She dodged, rolling across the damp floor, and came up swinging, her tail carving a gash across its chest. Sand sprayed everywhere, stinging Elias's eyes as he scrambled for another rock. He threw it, aiming for the creature's cluster of eyes, and it reared back with a piercing wail, momentarily blinded. Zira seized the chance, leaping onto its back and driving her tail through its neck. The beast convulsed, collapsing in a pile of grit, and she slid off, breathing hard. Elias stumbled to her side, his hands shaking as he gripped her arm. "You're not bad in a fight," she said, a faint smirk tugging her lips despite the blood dripping from a shallow cut on her thigh. He managed a weak grin, brushing sand from his face. "Had to do something." The cave's walls glistened faintly, reflecting the chaos, and Zira straightened, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the shadows. A low rumble echoed from deeper within, the ground shifting slightly beneath their feet, and she pulled him toward a tunnel branching off to the side, her tail flicking restlessly as the air grew thick with the scent of wet earth and something sharper. Elias followed Zira into the tunnel, the air growing heavier with each step as the scent of wet earth sharpened into something metallic. The walls narrowed, sprouting jagged, thorn-like protrusions that glinted faintly in the dim light filtering from above. Zira moved ahead, her tail flicking to clear a path, snapping the brittle spikes with sharp cracks. Elias ducked as one grazed his shoulder, tearing a fresh rip in his sleeve, and he cursed under his breath, his boots slipping on the slick stone floor. A thorn caught his calf, slicing through fabric and skin, and he stumbled, blood welling hot against his leg. Zira spun back, her purple eyes narrowing as she saw him falter. "Keep moving," she snapped, but her voice softened as she dropped to one knee beside him. She tore a strip from her own leather gear, her fingers quick and steady as she wrapped it around his wound, tying it tight. Her hands lingered for a moment, warm against his skin, and he caught the faint tremble in them, something he hadn't seen before. "You're slowing me down," she muttered, though her grip on his arm was gentle as she pulled him up. The tunnel shook faintly, dust raining from the ceiling, and the distant snarls of the Kerzel echoed through the stone, closer than they'd been since the cave. Zira's tail lashed out, shattering another thorn blocking their way, and she tugged him forward, her pace unrelenting as the passage twisted deeper into the dark. The tunnel widened into a small alcove, its walls studded with glowing blue veins that cast a soft light over Zira's bronze skin. Elias leaned against the stone, catching his breath, his leg throbbing beneath the makeshift bandage. Zira stood close, her tail swaying as she scanned the shadows, but her gaze drifted back to him. She stepped nearer, her hand brushing his sweat-damp hair, fingers lingering as she pushed it from his forehead. "I don't want you to die here," she said, her voice low, almost breaking. Elias looked up, meeting her purple eyes, and pulled her closer, his hands resting on her arms. He pressed a slow, tender kiss to her forehead, feeling her tremble slightly under his touch, her breath catching in a quiet gasp. "I'm not going anywhere," he whispered, his lips brushing her skin as he spoke. Zira's hands slid to his chest, pressing there as if anchoring herself, and she leaned into him, her warmth seeping through his torn shirt. Her tail curled gently around his waist, a soft, protective hold, and for a moment, the tunnel's damp chill faded beneath the heat of their closeness. She pulled back just enough to look at him, her fingers tracing the edge of his jaw, and the air between them hummed with a quiet intensity. The alcove's glow flickered, casting shadows across her face, and a distant rumble shook the ground, stirring the dust around their feet. Elias shifted, his back against the wall as Zira's hands dropped from his chest, her gaze turning to the tunnel ahead. "Why do they hunt you so fiercely?" he asked, voice rough from exertion. She exhaled sharply, her tail flicking as she spoke. "I killed their leader," she said, her words clipped, carrying a weight that hung in the air. "He planned to slaughter a weaker tribe, women, children, all of them, for sport." She stepped forward, her boots crunching on loose gravel, and Elias followed, listening as she continued. "I couldn't stand it, their cruelty, their pride. So I challenged him, drove my tail through his heart." Her voice hardened, and she brushed a hand over the cut on her thigh, still glistening with blood. "They called it betrayal. I called it justice." Elias glanced at her, his brow furrowing. "Then why stay here? Why not leave this place?" She paused, turning to face him, her eyes fierce yet shadowed. "To prove I was right," she said. And now, because of you. Her words lingered as she moved again, leading him through the tunnel's twists, the glowing veins pulsing faintly along the walls. The ground trembled again, a low groan echoing from behind, and Zira's pace quickened, her tail brushing his leg as she guided him onward, the air growing thick with tension. A sharp crack split the silence, stone shattering somewhere behind them. Zira froze, her head snapping back as the sound of grinding claws and guttural snarls spilled into the tunnel. "They found another way," she muttered, grabbing Elias's arm and pulling him into a sprint. The tunnel curved sharply, the glowing veins dimming as darkness swallowed the path ahead. Dust rained from the ceiling, stinging his eyes, and he heard the Kerzul's tails thrashing against the walls, their roars growing louder with every step. Zira shoved him around a corner, her tail lashing out to dislodge a loose rock, sending it crashing behind them to slow the hunters. Elias stumbled, his wounded leg buckling, but she caught him, her grip firm as she hauled him upright. Shadows flickered at the tunnel's edge, bronze skin and purple eyes glinting through the haze, spears raised and venom dripping. One of the Kerzul lunged, its claws swiping inches from Elias's back, and Zira spun, her tail striking its arm with a sickening crunch. The hunter snarled, recoiling, but more shapes loomed behind it, their movements relentless. Zira dragged Elias deeper, the tunnel narrowing again, and the air grew colder, heavy with the scent of damp stone and something faintly sour as they pressed on, the hunter's growls reverberating through the dark. The tunnel's sour scent thickened as Elias and Zira raced deeper, the Kerzul's snarls reverberating off the narrowing walls. The passage shuddered, and 5 warriors burst through a side crevice, their bronze skin glinting with sweat, purple eyes blazing with fury. Their spears shimmered with venom, and their tails lashed like whips, cracking against the stone. Zira shoved Elias behind her, her tail snapping up as the lead Kerzul charged, its spear aimed at her chest. She twisted aside, her tail slashing through the air to sever the weapon's shaft, sending the tip clattering to the ground. The hunter roared, lunging with its claws, and she met it head-on, driving her tail into its thigh. Coppery blood sprayed, staining the cave floor, but a second Kerzul swung from the side, its spear grazing her shoulder. Zira hissed, stumbling as blood welled from the wound, a bright streak against her bronze skin. Elias grabbed a fallen spear, its weight unfamiliar in his hands, and thrust it forward as another hunter leapt at her. The blade sank into its chest, and it crumpled with a guttural cry, blood pooling beneath it. "Stay away from her," he shouted, his voice raw, adrenaline surging through him. Zira glanced at him, her eyes flashing with something fierce, and she spun back into the fray, her tail whipping out to strike a third Kerzul across the face. The cave echoed with their roars, the air thick with dust and the metallic tang of blood as the remaining 2 closed in, their movements relentless. Elias pressed his back against Zira's, feeling the heat of her body through his torn shirt as the 2 Kerzul circled them. Her tail coiled briefly around his leg, steadying him, and she muttered, "Don't falter now." He nodded, gripping the spear tighter, its shaft slick with blood. One hunter lunged, its claws slashing at his chest, and he swung the spear up, deflecting the blow with a jarring clang. The force rattled his arms, but he held firm, driving the tip into the Kerzul's shoulder. It snarled, recoiling, and Zira moved in sync, her tail piercing its side with a wet crunch. The second Kerzul leapt from above, its tail aimed at Elias's head, and he ducked, shoving Zira aside as the appendage slammed into the ground, cracking the stone. She rolled, coming up behind it, and wrapped her tail around its neck, yanking it back with a savage twist. The hunter thrashed, claws flailing, and Elias thrust his spear through its chest, pinning it to the floor. It convulsed, then went still, blood pooling around them. Elias staggered, a claw mark bleeding across his chest, and Zira caught his arm, her breath ragged. The cave's walls glistened with moisture, reflecting the carnage, and the air grew still, heavy with the weight of their survival as she pulled him closer, her grip trembling slightly. Zira's eyes locked onto Elias, her chest heaving as she dropped her guard, the last Kerzel's body twitching faintly behind her. She rushed to him, her hands cupping his face, fingers tracing the blood streaking his cheeks. Coppery droplets from her shoulder fell onto his chest, mingling with his own, and she pressed herself against him, her voice breaking. "You're still here," she whispered, her tail curling tightly around his waist. Elias pulled her in, his hands sliding to her back, feeling the strength beneath her trembling frame. "For you," he said, voice low, and he claimed her gently in the dim cave light, a slow, deliberate act filled with raw need and care. Her body shuddered against his, a soft moan escaping her lips as she clung to him, her fingers digging into his shoulders. The air grew warm around them, the damp stone forgotten as their breaths intertwined, her tail tightening its hold. Blood and sweat mixed on their skin, but he moved with her in a quiet rhythm, ensuring she felt every ounce of his resolve. When the moment faded, she buried her face in his neck, her breath hot and uneven, and he held her close, his hand stroking her hair. Her blood-stained fingers brushed his chest, and she murmured, "You're my strength," her voice barely audible over the distant drip of water echoing through the cave. Elias eased Zira down beside him, their backs against a slick wall as the cave settled into an uneasy silence. She rested her head on his shoulder, her tail loosening its grip, but still draped across his lap, warm and heavy. He wiped blood from his hands on his torn pants, his chest rising and falling with deep, shaky breaths. The bodies of the Kerzel lay scattered around them, their purple eyes dulled, spears broken and useless. Zira's hand found his, her fingers lacing through his own, sticky with blood and sand. "They'll come back," she said, her tone flat, eyes fixed on the tunnel's shadowed depths. "More of them, too many." Elias squeezed her hand, feeling the calluses on her palm, and nodded. "Then we'll be ready," he replied, his voice steady despite the ache spreading through his body. She shifted, her shoulder brushing his, and traced a finger along the claw mark on his chest, her touch light but lingering. The cave's air grew cooler, the faint glow of the walls dimming as moisture trickled down the stone, pooling near their feet. Zira's tail twitched, stirring the sand beside them, and she tilted her head, listening to the distant hum of the planet's restless heart as they sat there, hands still clasped, the echoes of their fight fading into the dark. Elias and Zira moved from the cave's damp shadows, their clasped hands brushing as they stepped into a wider chamber where the air shifted, carrying a faint hum of energy. The walls rose high, carved with towering stone pillars etched with swirling symbols that pulsed with a dim, golden light. Sand crunched under their boots, scattered across a floor worn smooth by time, and Elias squinted at the markings, tracing one with his fingers. "This isn't Kerzel," he said, his voice echoing softly. "It's older, something they erased." Zira's tail flicked as she scanned the ruins, her purple eyes narrowing at a cracked pedestal in the center, its surface etched with faint grooves like a map. "They destroyed anything that wasn't theirs," she muttered, stepping closer, her hand brushing a pillar as if testing its strength. Elias followed, his legs still aching from the thorn wound, and noticed a shimmer beneath the sand, a fragment of metal, half buried, glinting like a lost relic. He knelt, digging it free, revealing a shard inscribed with the same symbols. "You might be more than just an outcast," he said, holding it up to her. "Maybe you're tied to this." Zira's gaze softened, her fingers grazing his as she took the shard, and the hum in the air grew stronger, vibrating through the stone beneath them. Zira turned the shard in her hands, her tail swaying slowly as she stared at the glowing symbols, their light reflecting in her eyes. Elias watched her, leaning against a pillar, his chest still marked with dried blood. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice gentle. She exhaled sharply, her grip tightening on the shard. "I'm afraid," she admitted, her tone low. almost lost in the chamber's hum. Not of them, of not being strong enough to keep you alive. Her tail brushed the ground, stirring the sand, and Elias stepped closer, his hand resting on hers. "You don't have to do it alone," he said, his fingers curling around hers, steadying her trembling grip. "I'm here with you." She looked up, her purple eyes searching his, and her free hand reached out, tracing the line of his arm, her touch warm and hesitant. "You make me want to believe that," she whispered, her voice catching as she leaned into him, her forehead resting briefly against his. The weight of her words hung between them, and Elias slid his hand to her shoulder, feeling the tension in her frame ease slightly as the ruins' golden glow flickered around them, casting long shadows across the sand. In the quiet corner of the ruins, Elias pulled Zira closer, his hand sliding from her shoulder to her hip, fingers brushing the edge of her leather gear. "We need each other," he said, his voice a low murmur, steady despite the hum vibrating through the stone. She pressed herself against him, her tail curling gently around his leg, its warmth seeping through his torn pants. Her hands found his chest, tracing the claw marks with a tenderness that made his breath catch, and she tilted her head, her lips hovering near his. "More than you know," she whispered, her breath warm against his skin. Elias leaned in, claiming her with a slow, reverent kiss, deeper than before, his hands steady on her hips as she melted into him. A soft shiver ran through her, her tail tightening its hold, and a quiet sigh escaped her lips, muffled against his. The moments stretched, their closeness a silent strength amidst the ruins, her bronze skin warm under his touch. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his chest, her fingers lingering on his shoulders, and the golden light pulsed faintly, illuminating the sand around their feet. Zira stepped back, her tail unwinding from Elias as she scanned the chamber, her eyes sharp again. She moved to the pedestal, brushing sand from its surface, and uncovered a hidden compartment, a long, curved sword, its blade etched with the same swirling symbols, glinting in the dim light. Elias joined her, his hand brushing hers as she lifted it, testing its weight. "This could turn the fight," she said, her voice firm, and handed it to him. He gripped the hilt, the metal cool against his palm, and swung at once, the blade slicing the air with a faint hum. "Together, we'll make it work," he replied, passing it back to her. She nodded, her tail flicking as she sheathed it at her side, then turned to a pile of broken stone, pulling free a smaller dagger for him. Elias took it, spinning it in his hand, and they moved to the chamber's edge, peering through a crack in the wall. Beyond, the red dunes stretched under the twin suns, and faint shapes moved in the distance. More Kerzel, their bronze hides glinting as they approached. Zira's hand brushed his arm, her touch lingering as she adjusted her stance, the sword gleaming at her hip as the hum of the ruins faded into the sound of wind whistling through the stone. Elias tightened his grip on the dagger as Zira adjusted the ancient sword at her hip, her purple eyes fixed on the approaching Kerzel through the crack in the ruins. The wind howled louder, whipping sand across the dunes, and the distant shapes grew clearer. A dozen warriors, their bronze hides gleaming under the twin suns, tails lashing with purpose. Leading them was a towering figure, its armor scarred and heavy, a jagged spear in its claws. Zira's jaw tightened. "Their new alpha," she muttered, stepping out into the open, the sword catching the light. Elias followed, his heart pounding, and the Kerzel roared as they spotted them, charging across the red sand in a wave of fury. Zira sprinted forward, her tail whipping behind her, and Elias matched her pace, the dagger raised. She swung the sword in a wide arc, its blade slicing through the first warrior's spear and chest, coppery blood spraying the sand. Elias ducked a tail strike, plunging his dagger into another Kerzel's side, twisting it free as the creature crumpled. The alpha bellowed, its spear slashing toward Zira, and she parried, the clash ringing out like thunder. Elias darted in, stabbing at its leg, but a tail lashed out, slamming him into the sand. Pain flared through his ribs, and he rolled, scrambling up as Zira drove her sword into a second hunter, her tail piercing another's throat. The alpha swung again, its spear grazing her side, and she staggered, blood dripping down her leg. Elias shouted her name, lunging forward as the chaos of battle swirled around them, sand and blood mixing underfoot. Zira stumbled, her sword dipping as the alpha towered over her, its spear raised for a killing blow. Elias charged, his vision narrowing to that single moment, and drove his dagger into the alpha's back, piercing through its armor. The beast roared, twisting to swipe at him, but he held on, twisting the blade deeper. Zira regained her footing, her tail coiling around the alpha's leg, yanking it off balance. Together, they struck, her sword slashing across its chest, his dagger plunging into its neck. The alpha collapsed, its massive form crashing into the sand, blood pooling beneath it. The remaining Kerzel faltered, their roars fading into snarls of confusion, and Zira spun, her sword flashing as she cut down one more. Elias grabbed her arm, pulling her upright as she swayed, her breath ragged. "You're hurt," he said, his voice tight, brushing her blood-streaked side. She leaned into him, her hand gripping his shoulder, and rasped, "You're my strength, Elias." Her tail brushed his leg, weak but steady, and he supported her weight, his eyes scanning the retreating hunters. They scattered into the dunes, their bronze shapes vanishing in the swirling sand, leaving only the echo of their defeat. Elias held her close, feeling her warmth against him, and wiped sand from her face, his fingers trembling as the wind carried the scent of blood and victory across the desert. Zira turned to Elias amidst the settling dust, her purple eyes softening as she pulled him into her arms, her sword dropping to the sand. She pressed her lips to his, a fierce, burning kiss that carried the weight of their survival, her hands clutching his torn shirt. Elias returned it, his arms wrapping around her, feeling her heartbeat against his chest. "We did it," she murmured against his mouth, her voice raw, her tail curling around his waist in a warm, possessive hold. He smiled, brushing her hair back, his fingers stained with her blood and his own. "Together," he said, his breath mingling with hers as they stood amidst the wreckage of their fight. Her bronze skin glowed under the twin suns, marred with cuts, but radiant, and she leaned into him, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The sand stretched endlessly around them, dotted with the fallen, and the wind tugged at their clothes, carrying away the last echoes of battle. Elias rested his forehead against hers, his hand sliding to her cheek, and she sighed, a sound of quiet triumph that warmed his core. Their closeness felt like a promise, forged in blood and fire, and the desert seemed to hum with their victory as they stood there, locked in each other's embrace. Elias and Zira stepped away from the ruined shadow, their hands linked as they faced the red horizon, the twin suns dipping lower, casting long shadows across the dunes. Her tail brushed his leg, a steady rhythm against the wind's restless pull, and she squeezed his hand, her grip firm despite the blood still drying on her skin. The ancient sword hung at her side, its symbols faintly glowing, a relic of a past they'd begun to unravel. Elias adjusted the dagger at his belt, its edge nicked but sharp, and glanced at her, catching the flicker of determination in her eyes. The sand shifted beneath their boots as they walked, leaving the battlefield behind, their steps steady despite the ache in their bones. A storm brewed in the distance, dark clouds rolling across the sky, and the air carried a faint, electric charge, stirring the dust at their feet. Zira's hair whipped in the breeze, and she tilted her head, listening to the planet's restless pulse as they moved forward, side by side, their shadows merging into one against the red expanse.